Snow fell in soft, unhurried drifts over the international terminal that morning, dusting the tarmac in a thin white hush that made the whole airport feel like it was holding its breath. Thousands of travelers moved through the concourse in the ordinary chaos of departure, dragging suitcases, checking boarding passes, sipping coffee from paper cups, none of them aware that within the hour they would witness something that would freeze them in place. Near Gate 14, close to the velvet ropes marking the entrance to business class boarding, a security officer raised his hand and struck a woman across the face with enough force to draw blood at the corner of her mouth. He had already called the police before his palm ever touched her skin, shouting that she was impersonating a premium passenger, that she was running some kind of scheme, that she needed to be removed before she caused more trouble. Nobody in that stunned crowd knew that the woman calmly wiping blood from her lip was Dr. Naomi Ellison, chairwoman of an infrastructure and aviation investment fund worth more than $180 billion, a woman who had flown in that very morning to finalize a $5 billion commitment to the same airline whose employee had just struck her. 15 minutes later, a single phone call would send the airline's entire executive leadership sprinting toward the airport in a panic that none of them would ever forget. Naomi had boarded a domestic connecting flight before dawn, the kind of quiet, unremarkable trip she often took when she wanted to think without the weight of her title trailing behind her. She wore a simple gray wool coat, unbranded and slightly worn at the cuffs, no jewelry beyond a thin wedding band. She still wore out of habit rather than sentiment. Her suitcase was a modest carry-on, with a broken wheel she had never bothered to replace. She pulled it herself across the polished floor of the terminal, her low-heeled boots leaving faint, wet prints from the slush outside, and she moved toward the priority boarding line with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms far more intimidating than any airport gate. She had done this 1,000 times. She never needed an entourage to know who she was. Her path to this quiet, unremarkable morning had been anything but ordinary. Naomi had grown up in a modest household outside Cleveland, the daughter of a school teacher and a transit mechanic, and she had spent much of her childhood watching her father come home with grease under his fingernails, listening to him explain the mechanics of engines, the way other fathers might explain baseball statistics. She had studied engineering before pivoting into finance, drawn by a conviction that the two disciplines were not as separate as most people assumed, that the same discipline required to design a bridge that would not collapse was required to structure an investment that would not collapse either. She built her fund from a modest starting pool of investors who believed in her thesis long before the broader financial world did, and over 2 decades, she had turned that fund into one of the most respected infrastructure investment vehicles in the country, quietly financing airports, rail systems, and power grids across dozens of states. She had learned early in her career that the rooms she walked into rarely expected her, and she had made peace with that reality by refusing to perform for anyone's expectations, wearing what was comfortable, carrying her own bags, speaking only when she had something worth saying. It had cost her, on occasion, moments exactly like the one now unfolding in front of her. It had never once cost her the composure she carried into every one of them. The officer standing at the entrance to that line was named Carl Benson, a man in his early 50s who had worked airport security for nearly 20 years and had, over that time, developed a set of assumptions he mistook for instincts. He looked at Naomi as she approached, his eyes moving in the quick, practice sweep he used on every passenger. And what he saw was a black woman in a plain coat, carrying a suitcase that looked like it belonged to someone flying economy, standing where he believed she did not belong. He did not see the calm authority in her posture. He did not see the way she held her boarding pass, unfolded and ready, the way someone does when they are used to being asked for it. He saw only what he had already decided to see, and he stepped directly into her path. "You are in the wrong line," he said, his voice flat and final, as though the matter were already settled. Naomi offered him a small, polite smile and extended her boarding pass toward him, the words "business class" and her full name printed clearly across the top. "I believe this is the correct line," she said. "Please take a look." Carl did not look. He barely glanced at the paper in her hand before reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder. his thumb pressing the call button with the practiced ease of a man who had made this exact decision many times before and never once been made to answer for it. Around them, the low murmur of the terminal began to shift. Heads turning, footsteps slowing, the particular kind of silence that spreads through a crowd when people sense that something is about to happen and do not yet know what to do about it. A few passengers lifted their phones out of habit rather than intention, unsure whether they were about to witness an inconvenience or something worse. Naomi remained still, her spine straight, her expression unreadable, the boarding pass still extended in her outstretched hand, waiting for a courtesy that was not coming. The tension held for a long moment, stretching across the gate like a held breath, while snow continued to fall silently beyond the windows, indifferent to everything unfolding inside. A businessman waiting nearby lowered his newspaper slightly, watching over the top edge of it, with the discomfort of someone who suspected he was witnessing an injustice, but had not yet decided whether it was his place to intervene. A young mother tightened her grip on her son's hand, pulling him gently back a step, murmuring something quiet to distract him from the rising tension at the gate. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. The particular cowardice of a crowd that senses wrongdoing but waits for someone else to act first settled over the gate like a fog, and in that fog, Carl's confidence only grew, mistaking the silence around him for agreement rather than discomfort. Carl told her to step aside, his tone sharpening now, edged with the particular impatience of a man who believed his authority was being tested rather than his judgment. Naomi did not raise her voice. She said only that she wanted to board her flight, nothing more, and that there had clearly been some kind of misunderstanding that could be resolved in a matter of seconds if he would simply look at the pass in her hand. To Carl, her calm did not read as innocence. It read as defiance, and defiance, in his mind, required an escalation. He radioed for backup, requesting officers to the gate, describing what he called a disturbance involving an unauthorized individual attempting to access the premium boarding area. Naomi reached into her coat pocket for her phone, intending to call her attorney, a habit so automatic after years of navigating rooms that misjudged her that she barely thought about it before doing it. But Carl misread the motion entirely. He saw her hand move and, in a decision he would spend the rest of his life trying to unmake, he knocked the phone from her fingers and struck her across the face in front of dozens of witnesses. The sound of the slap seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. For a moment, nobody moved. A woman near the ropes gasped audibly. A man clutched his young daughter's shoulder and pulled her back a step. 2 or 3 phones rose into the air, capturing what none of them yet understood they were witnessing. Nobody stepped forward to intervene. The particular paralysis of a crowd, unsure whether to trust its own eyes, settling over the gate like the snow settling outside. Naomi touched the corner of her mouth, felt the warmth of blood against her fingertips, and looked at Carl with an expression that held no fear at all, only a terrible, quiet clarity. "You have just placed this entire airline in the middle of a crisis," she told him, her voice even and unshaken. "You may not understand that yet, but you will." Carl let out a short, disbelieving laugh, waving off her words as the empty bravado of someone caught in an embarrassing situation. He had spent 20 years assuming that his uniform gave him the final word in moments like this one, that the badge on his chest carried more weight than whatever a passenger might say in her own defense, and nothing in his experience so far that morning had given him reason to doubt that assumption. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him, blood at her lip and boarding pass, still lying on the floor, where it had fallen, held more influence over the fate of his employer than the entire executive floor combined, and that his laughter, echoing faintly across the hushed gate, was very likely the last carefree sound he would make in that uniform. The gate had, by then, become something closer to a small theater, passengers on the way to entirely different flights slowing their steps as they passed, drawn by the particular gravity that surrounds a scene nobody wants to look away from. A gate agent for a different airline, working a counter several yards away, had stopped mid-sentence with a passenger to watch, her hands still frozen over her keyboard. An older man in a wheelchair, waiting near the window with a paperback novel open on his lap, lowered the book entirely and simply stared. Snow continued to drift past the windows behind them all, indifferent and steady, while inside the terminal, something far less peaceful was unfolding. Two police officers arrived within minutes, moving briskly through the parted crowd toward the gate, and Carl met them with a story already shaped to protect himself. He told them the woman had attempted to bypass security using a fraudulent premium boarding pass, that she had become combative when questioned, that she had resisted his attempts to remove her from the restricted area. He spoke with the fluent confidence of a man rehearsing a version of events he had already decided was true before it left his mouth. Naomi, standing quietly beside the ropes with her coat still slightly askew, said nothing to interrupt him. She simply reached into her bag and produced her passport, holding it out toward the responding officers with the same patient stillness she had shown from the very beginning. Neither officer examined the passport closely. One of them, younger and clearly following the lead of his more senior partner, reached for a set of handcuffs, asking Naomi to place her hands behind her back while they sorted out the confusion. Naomi did not resist, but she did not comply either, not out of defiance, but out of a simple, unshaken certainty in what was about to happen. "Let the cameras tell the truth," she said. "This airport has security footage of everything that happened here. I would suggest reviewing it before anyone makes a decision they cannot undo." Standing there with her wrists still free, blood drying at the corner of her mouth, Naomi found herself thinking, oddly, of her father, of the countless evenings he had come home exhausted from a job that paid him far less than his skill deserved, of the quiet dignity he had carried through decades of being underestimated by men who never once had to answer for their assumptions. She had built an entire career, in some sense, as an answer to that quiet unfairness, and here she was again, decades later, standing in a different kind of line, facing a different version of the same old judgment. She did not feel afraid. She felt, if anything, a kind of weary clarity, the sense that whatever happened next would matter far beyond this particular gate, on this particular morning, to her alone. A young woman working the check-in counter nearby, whose name was Lisa Monroe, had been watching the entire encounter with a growing unease she could not quite explain. She had glimpsed the name printed across the passport in the officer's hand, and something about it struck a chord of recognition she could not immediately place. She excused herself from her station and stepped quietly into the back office, pulling up the airline's internal directory of major investment partners on her terminal, and when the name populated on her screen along with a photograph, the color drained from her face. She did not say anything to the officers. She did not say anything to Carl. She picked up the phone and called her shift manager directly, her voice low and urgent, asking him to come to the gate immediately, telling him only that there was something he needed to see before anyone did anything further. The shift manager, a man named Frank Dawson, who had spent 15 years working his way up through the airline's ground operations, arrived at the gate within minutes, his expression already tight with concern, before he had even seen what was happening. He asked to see the passport the officers were holding, and the moment his eyes landed on the name printed beneath the photograph, his entire posture changed. His breathing seemed to catch. He looked up from the passport to the woman standing calmly in front of him, blood still faintly visible at the corner of her mouth, and he understood, with a sudden and sickening clarity, exactly what had just happened at his gate. "Dr. Naomi Ellison," he said quietly, almost to himself, the words landing in the tense air of the gate like a verdict. "Chairwoman of Ellison Global Infrastructure, the lead strategic partner on the terminal expansion, the investor behind the new fleet financing program." He turned to the officers and told them, in a voice that had gone suddenly formal and careful, that they needed to step back immediately, that a serious mistake had been made, that this was not a matter of a fraudulent boarding pass, but potentially the single worst public relations disaster in the airline's history. He explained, his words tumbling faster now, that Dr. Ellison's fund was in the final stages of a $5 billion investment into the airline, an agreement that included the purchase of an equity stake, the funding of a new terminal, and the financing of an entirely new fleet of aircraft. He explained that she had flown in that morning specifically to finalize the agreement in person, a courtesy she rarely extended to any partner, and that the signing had been scheduled for later that same afternoon. Carl's confident expression collapsed into something closer to dawning horror. He looked at Naomi again, seeing her now for the first time, not as a woman who did not belong in the priority line, but as the person whose signature could either save or sink the company that employed him. It was too late to take back the slap. It was too late to take back the accusation. All that remained was the reckoning that was already beginning to move through the airline's corporate offices like wildfire. Frank immediately called both the airport's general manager and the airline's regional director, his voice shaking slightly as he explained what had occurred at the gate, and within 20 minutes, those two calls had multiplied into a dozen more, climbing rapidly up the chain of command until they reached the airline's chief executive officer directly. By the time the full scope of the situation had been relayed, the executive team was already moving, coats grabbed off the backs of chairs, a black car pulling around to the front of headquarters, phones pressed to ears, as lawyers and public relations staff were summoned, with an urgency usually reserved for catastrophic system failures rather than a single altercation at a boarding gate. The chief executive officer, a man named Gregory Hall, who had led the airline for nearly 8 years, arrived at the terminal barely 40 minutes later, trailed by the company's general counsel, its head of public relations, and its chief operating officer, all of them moving through the concourse with the particular urgency of people who understood exactly how much was at stake and exactly how little time they had to contain it. The airport itself had shifted into a kind of hushed chaos. Employees whispering at their stations, supervisors pulled from their posts. The ordinary rhythm of departures and arrivals continuing around a gate that had become, without any of the traveling public quite understanding why, the center of a corporate emergency. Gregory had built his career on a reputation for steadiness, a calm, measured presence, who rarely raised his voice in a boardroom and who colleagues often described as unflappable. That morning, his composure had cracked entirely. He had been in a routine meeting reviewing quarterly maintenance costs when his assistant burst in without knocking, phone already extended toward him, her face pale. By the time he reached his car in the executive garage, his general counsel was already on the line, explaining, in halting, disbelieving fragments, what their shift manager had reported from the gate. Gregory had spent the entire ride to the airport, rehearsing what he might say, discarding one version after another, understanding somewhere in the pit of his stomach that no words he could assemble would undo what had already happened. He crossed the concourse at something close to a run, his coat still unbuttoned, his lawyer struggling to keep pace beside him, while reading updates off her phone in a low, urgent voice. Reporters, whose scanners had already picked up chatter about a disturbance at the airport, were beginning to gather near the entrance, though none of them yet understood the true scale of what they were circling. Gregory approached Naomi directly, extending an apology before he had even fully stopped walking, his words rushed and stumbling in a way that betrayed just how rattled he truly was. He apologized for the conduct of his employee, for the failure of his security protocols, for the injury she had suffered while standing on property his company operated. Naomi listened to all of it without interruption, her expression calm, betraying nothing of what she intended to do next. When he finished, she said only 4 words. "Show me the footage." The airport security team pulled the relevant camera feeds within minutes, projecting them onto a screen in a nearby operations office, where Gregory, his lawyers, Frank, and several other senior staff members gathered in tense silence to watch. The footage left no room for interpretation. It showed Naomi approaching the gate calmly, boarding pass extended. It showed Carl blocking her path without examining the pass. It showed her patience, her stillness, her complete absence of aggression, right up until the moment his hand struck her phone from her grip and then struck her face in front of dozens of witnesses. There was no resistance. There was no confrontation. There was only a man who had decided, based on nothing but the color of her skin and the plainness of her coat, that she did not belong, and who had acted on that decision with violence. The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the overhead lights seemed suddenly loud. Nobody spoke. Gregory closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening, the full weight of what his company was about to face, settling over him like a physical thing. It was only then that Naomi revealed the scope of what had truly been at risk that morning. The $5 billion commitment they had gathered to finalize was, she explained, only the first phase of a much larger partnership her fund had been quietly developing over the past year, an agreement that could expand to $12 billion if the initial phase proceeded successfully, encompassing not only the terminal expansion and fleet financing already discussed, but a long-term infrastructure partnership that would have positioned the airline as a leader in modernized, sustainable aviation for the next 2 decades. The airline's own communications team had already begun drafting a press release announcing the initial agreement, anticipating the signing scheduled for that afternoon. Word of the pending investment had leaked into financial circles days earlier, and the company's stock had climbed steadily on the rumor alone, investors eager for confirmation of a deal that size. Naomi reached into her bag and withdrew a folded document, placing it on the table in front of Gregory without ceremony. It was not the signing agreement they had all gathered to complete. It was a formal withdrawal notice, terminating the fund's commitment effective immediately, citing the incident at the gate as evidence of a corporate culture incompatible with the values her fund required of its partners. Gregory stared at the paper for a long moment, without touching it, the reality of what had just happened settling over him with a weight that seemed to physically bend his shoulders. News of the withdrawal moved through financial markets before the executive team had even left the airport. Analysts who had been quietly tracking the rumored investment began asking pointed questions the moment the company's stock price began to slide, and within hours the decline had accelerated into a full slide that wiped a significant percentage off the airline's market value. Reporters who had been following the rumored $5 billion deal began circling, sensing that something had gone badly wrong, and it did not take long for pieces of the story to surface, fragments of footage from bystanders who had captured the confrontation on their phones, beginning to circulate widely across public platforms of discussion. Banks that had been prepared to help finance portions of the fleet expansion, contingent on the Ellison partnership moving forward, quietly paused their own commitments, unwilling to extend themselves on a deal that suddenly looked far less certain. Inside the company, an internal investigation was launched within hours, board members demanding answers about how a single security officer's conduct had managed to jeopardize a partnership worth billions of dollars, and how systemic that kind of conduct might actually be across the airline's broader operations. Carl was suspended immediately, escorted from the terminal, under circumstances far different from the ones he had imagined that morning when he arrived for his shift. Frank, despite having ultimately raised the alarm that stopped the situation from growing even worse, found himself placed on administrative leave as well, pending a full review of how the incident had been allowed to escalate as far as it had before anyone in a position of authority intervened. The footage bystanders had captured continued spreading, drawing widespread public attention and becoming, within a single day, one of the most discussed stories in the country, the incident becoming the single most discussed story in the country within a matter of hours. Financial analysts who covered the airline industry found themselves fielding calls from anxious investors throughout the afternoon, most of them asking variations of the same question, wanting to know whether the rumored infrastructure partnership was truly dead or whether there remained some path toward salvaging it. A senior analyst at one of the larger investment banks published a brief note warning clients that the reputational damage alone could depress the airline's valuation for months, regardless of how the partnership itself resolved, arguing that public trust, once visibly broken, tended to heal far more slowly than balance sheets did. Airline employees at other airports across the network began quietly discussing the story among themselves, some expressing genuine shock, others admitting, in hushed conversations near break rooms and gate counters, that they had witnessed smaller versions of the same bias plenty of times before without anyone above them taking real notice. A handful of former passengers came forward in the days that followed, with their own accounts of being profiled or mistreated at the airline's gates, emboldened by the sudden public attention to speak about experiences they had previously assumed no one would believe. The airline's public relations department, normally accustomed to managing minor complaints and routine service disruptions, found itself utterly unprepared for a crisis of this magnitude. Every prepared statement they drafted felt inadequate against the footage already circulating, and every attempt at explanation risks sounding like an excuse. Gregory ultimately overruled his own communications team and insisted the company issue a short, unpolished statement acknowledging fault directly, without qualification, promising a full and independent review. It was, several of his advisors later admitted, the first decision of the crisis that actually slowed the bleeding rather than adding to it. 3 days later, the airline's board of directors convened an emergency session, gathering in a conference room on the top floor of company headquarters, with an urgency that matched the severity of what they now faced. Gregory stood before them and delivered an assessment far more honest than any of them had expected. The mistake, he told them, was not simply the slap that had occurred at the gate. That single act of violence had merely been the visible symptom of something far deeper and far more dangerous. A corporate culture that had, over years of inattention, allowed employees to evaluate passengers by appearance rather than by fact, to assume rather than to verify, to treat certain travelers with suspicion the company would never have permitted if it had been paying proper attention. That culture, he said, was the real crisis, and no public relations statement or financial settlement would be sufficient to repair it. Naomi appeared before the board later that same day, invited by Gregory himself, who understood by now that any path forward required her presence and her voice far more than it required his own explanations. She stood at the front of the room, no notes in her hand, and made clear from her opening words that she had not come seeking financial compensation of any kind. She did not want damages. She did not want a settlement. She wanted something the board found, in the moment, far more difficult to promise than money. She asked for a complete overhaul of the airline's security training program, with explicit modules addressing bias and the dangers of judging passengers by appearance rather than documentation. She asked for the creation of an independent oversight committee, separate from the airline's internal management structure, empowered to review complaints of discriminatory treatment, without interference from executives who might otherwise be inclined to protect the company's image over its passengers. She asked for full camera transparency at every security checkpoint and boarding gate across the airline's network, footage that would be retained and reviewable in the event of future disputes. And she asked for an accessible, independent channel through which any passenger could file a grievance and know it would be reviewed by people with no financial incentive to dismiss it. One board member, an older gentleman who had served on the airline's board for nearly 2 decades, asked Naomi quietly why she was not demanding a settlement, why she was not pursuing legal action against the company or against Carl personally, given everything she had endured. Naomi considered the question for a long moment before answering. Money changes hands, and the underlying problem remains exactly where it was, she told him. I am not interested in a transaction that lets everyone in this room feel as though the matter has been closed. I am interested in whether a woman who looks like me can walk through your gates 5 years from now and be treated the same as anyone else standing in that line. That is not something a settlement can guarantee. Only structural change can. Her words settled over the room in a way that seemed to shift something fundamental in how the board members understood the crisis they were facing. Several of them, who had entered the meeting still quietly, hoping the matter might be resolved through some combination of a public apology and a financial gesture, recognized in that moment that Naomi was asking for something far more difficult and far more permanent. The board approved every request without objection. No one in the room willing to argue against reforms that had, quite plainly, become existential to the company's survival. In the weeks that followed, the airline's Human Resources Division, working alongside outside consultants Naomi's fund had recommended, began the slow work of rebuilding its training curriculum from the ground up. Focus groups were held with current and former employees. Passenger complaint records going back several years were reviewed for patterns that had previously gone unexamined. The independent oversight committee was staffed with individuals from outside the airline entirely, including a retired civil rights attorney and a former airport ombudsman known for her uncompromising standards, both of whom made clear from their first meeting that they intended to hold the company to the letter of every commitment it had made. Carl requested a meeting with Naomi in the days that followed, and though his lawyer strongly advised against it, he insisted, arriving at the small conference room she had chosen, with his hands trembling and his eyes already red. He did not offer excuses. He did not attempt to explain away what he had done by pointing to stress or misunderstanding or the pressure of his job. He simply told her, his voice breaking partway through, that he was sorry, that he had let a lifetime of unexamined assumptions guide his hand in a moment that could never be undone, and that he did not expect her forgiveness but felt he owed her the attempt at an apology regardless. Naomi listened to him in silence, her expression neither cold nor especially warm, simply attentive, the same stillness she had carried at the gate days earlier. "I forgive you as a human being," she told him finally. "Everyone is capable of a moment of failure, and I believe you are capable of learning from this one. But forgiveness between us does not erase the responsibility your employer bears for the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. That responsibility exists separately from whatever exists between you and me." Carl nodded slowly, understanding settling over him in a way that seemed to age him several years in the span of a single conversation. He did not argue. He did not attempt to shift blame onto the company, onto his training, onto anyone but himself. He thanked her quietly for hearing him out, and he left the room without another word, carrying with him a weight he would spend a long time learning how to live with. He did not return to airport security work. In the months that followed, he took a position at a small hardware store outside the city, a quieter life that asked far less of him and offered, in return, far fewer opportunities to cause the kind of harm he now understood he was capable of. He spoke on occasion to groups of new airport hires being trained under the airline's revised program, not as a cautionary tale delivered by someone else, but as a man willing to stand in front of a room and describe, in his own halting words, exactly how quickly an assumption could turn into an act neither he nor anyone else could take back. He never framed it as redemption. He only ever called it an attempt to make sure the next Carl Benson never got the chance to become one. Frank, for his part, was eventually reinstated after the internal investigation concluded that his failure had been one of hesitation rather than complicity, and that his decision to alert someone above him, however delayed, had ultimately been the turning point that kept the situation from spiraling even further out of control. He returned to his position, with a humility that his colleagues noticed immediately, quicker now to double-check a story before accepting it, quicker to ask questions rather than assume answers. Lisa Monroe, the young check-in employee, whose quiet recognition had set the entire correction in motion, was promoted within the year to a supervisory role overseeing gate operations, her instinct for noticing what others missed becoming, within the company's new culture, something to be rewarded rather than overlooked. 6 months passed, and the airline that had nearly collapsed under the weight of a single morning's failure emerged from the crisis, transformed in ways few inside the company had believed possible at the outset. Every security officer across its network completed a new training program built around the very framework Naomi had insisted upon, one that emphasized verification over assumption and treated every passenger, regardless of appearance, with the same baseline of respect. The independent oversight committee she had demanded was fully operational, staffed by people with no stake in protecting the company's reputation over its obligations to the travelers who moved through its terminals every day. Camera systems had been upgraded and made fully transparent across every checkpoint, a visible reminder to employees and passengers alike that accountability was no longer optional. The changes rippled outward beyond the airline itself. Industry publications began covering the story, not merely as a scandal, but as a case study, other carriers quietly reaching out to Naomi's fund to ask how similar reforms might be implemented before a crisis forced their hand rather than after. A university business program invited Gregory to speak to its students about the months following the incident, and he accepted, telling the room candidly that the hardest lesson of his career had been discovering how much damage a company could inflict without ever intending to, simply by failing to examine the assumptions embedded in its own routines. He no longer described the incident as an isolated failure of one employee. He described it as a mirror the company had been forced, however unwillingly, to look into. The airline's stock, which had cratered in the days after the incident, spent months recovering, climbing slowly back as investors watched the reforms take hold and concluded, gradually, that the company's response had been substantive rather than cosmetic. Employee satisfaction surveys, conducted quietly through the new oversight committee, showed a marked shift in how staff described the culture around them, more of them reporting that they felt comfortable raising concerns, more of them saying they believed leadership would actually listen. None of it undid what had happened at the gate that winter morning, but all of it suggested that the company had chosen, in the end, to let that morning mean something rather than simply survive it. Naomi returned to that same airport on a quiet afternoon, much like the one that had upended so much 6 months earlier, though this time the snow outside had melted into the soft green edges of early spring. She walked toward the same gate, wearing the same plain gray coat, pulling the same suitcase with its still unrepaired wheel. And this time, a new employee at the check-in counter, a young woman who had only recently joined the company, looked up and greeted her with a warm and unguarded smile. "Welcome back, Dr. Ellison," she said. "It is truly our privilege to have you flying with us today." Naomi smiled back, something quiet and genuine settling in her expression, the kind of small satisfaction that comes not from vindication, but from evidence that change, however painfully it arrives, can take root and hold. Later that week, following further conversation with the board, she made the decision to restore her fund's investment in the airline, though not in the form originally proposed. The commitment would proceed only in its first phase, $500 million, directed specifically toward infrastructure and training reforms, with every subsequent phase of funding contingent on independently verified progress in corporate culture, transparency, and accountability. It was not the swift, sweeping partnership either side had once imagined. It was something slower, more deliberate, and in its own way, more honest. Gregory walked her to the gate himself that afternoon, a gesture that had become something of a quiet ritual between them in the months since the crisis first brought them into each other's orbit. Their conversations, which had begun as tense negotiations over reform timelines and oversight structures, had gradually loosened into something more easygoing, an unhurried rapport built on the strange intimacy of having weathered a disaster together and come out the other side with something worth respecting in each other. Neither of them named what was growing between them, not yet, but there was an ease in the way they walked side by side through the terminal, an unspoken understanding that whatever this was, it was worth letting unfold slowly. The same way she had insisted the reforms themselves unfold, one honest step at a time, rather than any performance of instant resolution. The aircraft lifted off into a pale winter sky, turning gradually toward spring, carrying passengers who had no idea how close the airline beneath them had come to losing everything, and how much of what they now took for granted, the courtesy at the gate, the fairness in the line, the simple assumption that they would be treated with dignity, regardless of how they looked or what they wore, had been rebuilt from the wreckage of a single terrible morning. A company can lose billions of dollars, not only through a flawed financial decision, but through a single moment of disrespect toward another human being. And sometimes, what truly saves an organization from ruin is not the money it manages to hold on to, but the courage it finds to change.